Welcome, one and all, and thank you for braving the exceedingly odd and cold weather to get here. We are especially delighted that our guest today, Dr. Anouar Majid, was able to make it from none other than New England. I'm still not quite sure how he made it here, but he did. His biggest travel problem came once he was at the cab driver couldn't find UMBC, couldn't distinguish it from UMB. UMAB. Where else did you go, Anouar? I'm sure.
UB, I guess.
UB. Not College Park, I hope. No. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we are very, very pleased to have him here today. This is, of course, the lecture on the post-Andalusian condition, Islam and the Rise of the West. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Drescher Center for the Humanities, of course, as well as the Global Studies program, and I am Bridget Starkey, Associate Director of Global Studies, and it's also co-sponsored by the Department of Modern Languages, Linguistics, and Intercultural Communication. Thank you for your co-sponsorship. I feel that we could not have a more relevant, a more appropriate lecturer here today if someone had been dropped out of the sky for us, literally. The research of Dr. Majid is heavily involved in the history of Muslims, the forced expulsion of Muslims from various places around the world. His research is truly global in that it connects those events, those historical events and experiences with those that are happening to other communities, including Latinos and Muslims, again, in today's international system. And he works across disciplines, across regions. It is truly the essence of global research, global work. Dr. Majid, I mentioned, comes to us from the University of New England, where he is the director for the Center for Global Humanities. He's also the vice president for Global Affairs and Communication, a professor of English, which is, by the way, how he comes to also be the author of a very well-received fictional novel in addition to his academic works. His fictional novel, Si Youssef, has been very well received around the globe. He wears so many hats. He's also the co-editor of a Moroccan-American magazine endeavor, magazine on culture and ideas, a joint effort called Tingis. Let me just mention, I don't want to take away from his time, he has a very extensive resume, but let me mention a few of the true highlights. Amongst his books, he has written with Duke University Press in 2000, Unveiling Traditions, Post-Colonial Islam in a Polycentric World. With Stanford University Press in 2004, Freedom and Orthodoxy, Islam and Difference in the Post-Andalusian Age. With Roman and Littlefield in 2007, Islam and America, and I believe that's been updated. Perhaps need to be updated again. With the University of Minnesota Press, We Are All Moors, Centuries of Crusades Against Muslims and Other Minorities in 2009. Dr. Majid is a frequent guest on very high-profile programs, including Bill Moyer's Journal, National Public Radio, and Al Jazeera, amongst many others. If I had to encapsulate his message, I would say he argues against faith-based prejudices. He does this through the telling of personal stories interwoven with historical stories, which makes his methodology and his work very accessible, but also of the highest intellectual pursuit. So I would like to welcome, on behalf of UMBC, Dr. Anouar Majid.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're done. Good evening or good afternoon. Okay, I know the camera's watching me. I don't want to take away from the aesthetics. Cup of coffee. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for Global Studies and the Drescher Center, and all the faculty and the students who braved the weather. It's very cold in Baltimore, by the way. You know, it's I mean, I wasn't expecting this kind of weather. And welcome to join me in a reflection about Islam, the West, and the post-Andalusian condition. The book that was published by Stanford University Press is called Freedom and Orthodoxy, but initially I wanted to call it Post-Andalusianism. And the editor, a very, very nice guy, told me that the word does not exist in the English language. And I said, well, let's try to create it. Let's make it happen. Let's create a new expression or concept. And just like Orientalism has become a widespread concept in the literature, called post-Andalusianism. And the reason why I choose that word, now it's in the subtitle of the book, but nevertheless. So the reason why I chose that is because something very dramatic happened in 1492. I mean, symbolically, it's symbolic for sure, but something very dramatic. It was the last bastion of the Islamic presence in Spain was defeated. The keys were surrendered to the monarchs of Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And Christopher Columbus, the Jews were expelled from Spain, and so they had to find refuge in other parts of the globe. And the Christopher Columbus finally, undertook his voyage in quest of Asia, through the Atlantic Ocean and then here in this continent, and opened up this world to new explorations, new conquests, and new, and therefore thereby changing the rest of the world and world history. What's interesting in Spain to me, and I grew up very close to Spain, in Tangier, which is 9 miles away. You could see Spain. You could see Spain, the horizon. You could see the mountains almost every day in clear weather. What's interesting to me about Spain is it gets forgotten in this discussion about what's happening in the world today. And, because we are so Anglo-centric or so Anglophone in our approach to cultural studies, to theory, to post-colonial studies, that very few, except for those who do Latin American studies or Spanish studies, where Hispanic studies tend to pay attention, or tend to closer attention to Spain and its impact. But we seem to forget that it was Spain, sorry, that opened up this continent for explorations. Christopher Columbus was dispatched by the Spanish monarchs to undergo or to explore, to find this new world of Asia, which eventually ended up being the Americas for them. And the first conquistadors, the first conquerors who came to the Americas were Spanish, mostly from Al-Andalus, southern Spain, and many of whom had participated in wars against Muslims. And so it is no wonder when the conquistadors, or when the conquerors, or so, well, let's stick with the word conquistadors, when they came to the Americas, they found people that reminded them of the Moors back home. And so they launched a war on them, first to convert them into the Christian faith, otherwise to enslave them. The end result was a genocide of a massive scale. About something like 80% of the indigenous population of the Americas perished in the first century after the discovery by Christopher Columbus. So it is, by any measure, that would be called a genocide. And the imagery they used to describe the Indians was reminiscent of the ones that they had used to describe or to deal with the Moors. Now, the Moors is a very amorphous, ambiguous term. in Morocco, for example, which I'm a native of Morocco, people do not know how to translate it. I once wrote a piece, thank you so much. I once wrote a piece, sorry. I once wrote a piece, and somebody said, instead of saying we are all Moors, to say we are all Moors, said we are all Moroccan. But in Arabic, it doesn't translate well. What it means is really Muslims. So it's one of the expressions applied to Muslims in Spain, but also in other places, Muslims would be known as Turcos, as Turks, and you would not find in the Middle Ages many people calling Muslims Muslims, at least not in the literature that I was dealing with. So usually, they are the Saracens in older times, and the Ishmaelites in even older times. But for now, for our purposes, is the Moors and the Turks, and for our purposes, the Moor. And it is an interesting episode in Spanish history because Spain, and the process, as you know, just a recapitulation of the history, the Muslims came into Spain in the 8th century. They conquered Spain progressively till they dominated most of it. And then soon after, the Catholic forces began to regroup in northern parts of Spain and began a process called the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain from Muslim domination. So by the 13th century, most of the process was complete. There remained a few bastions of Islamic presence here and there until they were finally eliminated in 1492, a very interesting year in history. And it was the culmination of a process of consolidating a Spanish identity, because Spain is really a nation of many nations, different languages, different histories, different memories. They're Basques, they're Catalans, they're Andalusians, and so it was an attempt to unify this diverse society into one nation. So in 1492, Catholicism became, was decreed to be the official religion of the state. And so there was a tremendous insistence on what's called the purity of faith. At the same time, the Castilian language has just been a grammar or a lexicon of the Castilian language by a man called Nebrija had just been published, and explicitly to accompany Spain in its imperial ambitions. So you have the creation of one ideology, which is the Catholic faith, based on the Catholic faith or the unity of faith, and you have an emerging language, a Castilian language, which is going to be the language of empire. And we have a racially pure nation as well, because in the 15th century, in the 1400s, their law was established, known as the limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood, and therefore that was instituted to extricate or to eliminate any influence initially from the Jews, but eventually was applied to the Muslims as well. So anybody, eventually after 1492, when the Muslims were initially given their full rights and promised that they would have equal rights in the Spanish society, eventually, they reneged on that very quickly, and they began a persecution of Muslims. It was very intense persecution of the Muslim way of life, and a pressure on them tremendous pressure was applied on them to convert to the Catholic faith. And even when they converted to the Catholic faith, they remained suspect because they were not genealogically Christians, if you could believe that. It's something that went against the papal idea or the Pope's idea of conversion, but eventually the Pope himself, went along with this in the middle of the 16th century and sort of blessed this approach, especially using the Inquisition. So you could not, even if you converted to the Catholic faith, you are not fully Christian or Spaniard because you're not genealogically Christian, you're not genealogically Catholic. So notions, a national language, racial purity, and unity of faith were the three ingredients established by Spain more, earlier than any other nation in modern history to establish what we nowadays call a national identity. In other words, you need to be of a certain race, to speak a certain language, and to have a certain kind of ancestry. And so it is that model that became the premise or the basis of nationalism, of modern nationalism, and eventually led to all kinds of horrors in the 20th century. I talk about them in my books. When the racial policies of the Nazis were reminiscent of Spanish policies of the purity of blood, the insistence on a national language also still to this day is very much alive, and the racial overtones in the description of national identity are still with us today. So it is Spain that created the template, if you will, for what constitutes a nation, for better or worse. It's good to remember that Spain was a powerful nation in the 15th century and the 16th centuries, and then of course it's no longer nowadays. When Spain went through other kinds of histories, and it's in a different place now. This kind of pressure was applied both in my book Freedom and Orthodoxy on Native Americans after the conquest of the American continent, and on Muslims in different parts of the Islamic world. And in both cases, as I looked at these two civilizations and how they dealt with European hegemony, European imperialism, European colonialism, as I studied the reaction of both peoples, let's say, to this situation, you could see both Muslims and Native Americans retreating into what we nowadays call orthodoxies. They're going back to their own identities, hanging on to what they think are the authentic selves, authentic histories, authentic cultures, authentic traditions, in order to fight back the domination of alien cultures. And that process hasn't stopped yet. Even so, the reason why the book is titled Freedom and Orthodoxy is on one hand, you have Christian missionaries or Christian conquistadors or European imperialists or European colonialists, going out to save the natives of the world from the sunken conditions they are in, or that they are trying to go out and give them a better way of life, and sometimes and often introduce them to the Christian faith in order to save the natives from themselves, and so on. The natives would say, well, how about our own cultures and traditions? We have our own ways of life. Why should we follow yours? So the Christian missionary work was a way to exercise the domination of Europe over other nations, and eventually the formula changed over time. It was at one time Catholicism, and then another time it would be in the name of science and civilization, sometimes in the name of the Enlightenment, and sometimes in all, freedom. So there were all kinds of reasons why the Europeans tried to impose themselves on other peoples and cultures, and had a very disruptive impact on them. All right, so this is the story of the villainous West. This is, when we talk about the West, Europe, it is very customary in American universities and European universities to see it as the villainous other. But that's, in other words, if you're a Muslim or Native American or somebody who is not associated genealogically and otherwise with Western or European civilization. But this is a narrative that also simplifies, the nature of human history. Now, I'm not talking about the book I wrote in 2004, but I'm talking about trying to relate that history to the present. And I know a lot of people today have a lot of questions about the relations between the United States or Europe or the West with with Muslims, Latinos, and people from the African continent, etc. And of course, when I was looking at this condition in 2004, I advocated what's called provincialism, which is a way to create a system, a world of cultures, each one of which would have its own authentic identity, but all interacting together and living together in a form of perpetual dialogue and interaction. I'm beginning to find that probably it's easier said than done. And I think because one of the things we always underestimate is the powers of capitalism to homogenize world civilizations. And I think, Eric Hobsbawm, it's interesting, somebody I discussed to some extent in the book, he talks about the twin revolutions, or the three industrial revolution, but also the American Revolution and the French revolutions. And if you look at them very closely, now we have moved away from the age of Spanish conquests and the age of discovery to talk about a new age of freedom in the name of universal or universalist ideals. The first one is the American Revolution. American Revolution, and these are things that Edward Said in his book Orientalism and in his work doesn't pay enough attention to. And that's why I wrote this book called Post-Andalusianism, or a book with, or the current title of Freedom and Orthodoxy. Because if you look very closely at these revolutions, let's say the American Revolution, for example. The American Revolution was about liberating people from a variety of oppressions. Of course there was slavery. Of course women didn't have their full rights. Of course Native American rights were not met. But it created a system, a new way of thinking about the place of the individual, the free individual in society, or a citizen. For the first time in history, we have a system of divided sovereignties or powers. And of course, which for the first time since Roman times, there is a republic, no king. For the first time. The first time we have a constitution that's still in effect today, that outlines the role of each branch of government. And who is qualified to serve in these governments? Muslims theoretically are. And then this revolution, this intellectual revolution or political revolution, which is a combination of ideas of the Enlightenment and something very practical, very English and very practical that comes out of the English tradition of politics and self-government. And also there's some elements of religiosity in it, but not too visible in the Constitution, because Jefferson played a good role, a significant role in some of it, and others as well. What you have is it unleashed, the people began to talk about a new era, a new vision of the world, a new vision of freedom. So it unleashed the powers of conversion. Americans fanned out across the globe to convert people into their own Protestant faith. Many of them went to the Middle East. They didn't have a lot of success. And some of the people who came out of that tradition, ironically enough, is Edward Said, because his family became a Protestant, converted to Protestantism. But in other words, there was an idea that the American way of life is best for everybody. And it wasn't necessarily, it didn't come out of a very malicious intent. It came out of an euphoric, a euphoric celebration of life, the idea that the future is limitless. I was just reading Walt Whitman recently, and you get that same sense in Whitman's poetry. It is the idea that the Homo Americanus, the new species of humanity, has the power to unleash freedoms around the globe. And of course, yes, other people would see it as trespassing on their rights, as infringing on their freedoms, and so on. But that was the power of the American Revolution. The French Revolution had the same effect, even more dramatic than that, and more transformative in many parts of the globe. Again, in the name of the same principles and the same ideas. When I was looking at the Declaration of Independence, for example, which was issued in 1776. 50 years after the publication or the issuance of the Declaration of Independence, many countries, many others began to issue their own declarations. And in the 20th century, a lot of nations too began to copy the American model and pen their own declarations of independence. The Declaration of Human Rights, for example, is another sort of act, a gesture of indebtedness to the great principle of freedom that had come out of the American Revolution. How then do we deal with the impact of these revolutions, given that they're not necessarily driven by vile sentiments, not necessarily, and they're not driven necessarily, there's a lot of elements of freedom embedded in them. And especially in the case of the Arabs and Muslims, for example, the up to the middle of the 20th century, the United States was considered to be a beacon of freedom. In fact, polls taken in the early part of the 20th century in the Middle East, came out saying that the people of the region would rather have the United States, an American mandate over them, than be subject to the French or the British. So America was seen in much of the Arab world, the Middle East, and North Africa in some cases, as a revolutionary force, as a place, as a country that had defeated the great imperial power of its time, Great Britain, and then of course it had an eye for it supported all the freedoms around the globe. Nowadays, this history gets forgotten, and I'm saying. So the question, so let's go back again to the story. So there was colonialism, there was imperialism, and now we came to a new era in the history of these relations between the West and East, or between Muslims and Europeans or Euro-Americans. But the circumstances have changed. And how are we going to respond to these new circumstances? For example, when I talk in one of my books, when I look at what's happening today, let's say around the issue of immigration, I had mentioned this in We Are All Moors, the book that deals with this issue, how Muslims are problematic in Europe and Latinos are problematic in the United States. And so how does one begin to read this history? Are we going to use the same lenses we used in the past? And I did. For example, I saw that I started comparing what happened in Spain and what's happening in the United States. And I published a book in 2009 on the 400th anniversary of the decree to expel all people of Muslim descent from Spain. It was April 9th, 1608. The anniversary is almost upon us, but it's when the King of Spain decided to expel massively, like the same kind of talk that's happening in some circles today, all people of Muslim descent from Spain. It took a huge effort, 4 or 5 years of a military operation that combined all the forces from Europe to take out 3%, between 3 or 5% of Spain's population and scatter it around the globe. Many came to Morocco, some came to Tunisia, Algeria, some to Turkey, and some to France. So it was a horrible event in history. And it was not even remembered or celebrated or reflected upon on the 400th anniversary when it came upon us. That's why I wrote that book in 2009. But are we reliving the same circumstances or not today? I don't think so. I think humanity has moved to a different level. I don't know exactly what it is, but that's why I need to have a conversation with you. I don't think anyone in his right mind will want to expel the estimated 12 million illegal immigrants in the United States. It would be an impossible military operation. It will be it won't be feasible. Or do the same thing in Europe for the Muslim populations in Europe. So I think I think what's happened now, we are in a different world order. We are in a different set of mind. And I think the theories we've been using, I have been using in my early career, I don't think they're suitable enough now. See, the thing is, when we are academics, you know, we start writing on a subject and we start theorizing about things. And then we feel obligated to stay with that then theoretical model for the rest of our thinking career. But, you know, at some point, to me, I began to realize, or I began to see things differently. I mean, we can have a conversation about that too. But it's, I think what is happening now is where we have a genuine clash, and I hate to use that expression because it has been maligned and we know the author and so on. It's a genuine clash of civilizations. And I wrote about Samuel Huntington and others in my, before. What it is people see the world differently, and people are attached to visions of the world that makes a dialogue or a common reflection nearly impossible. We see it on a global scale, and we see it on a local scale. It's becoming worse and worse. I mean, nobody is listening to anybody else. We just live in bubbles, both at the national level and a global level. People live in their cultural bubbles, and they have become increasingly incapable of having a conversation with people whose ideas differ from theirs. And I think that is a bad sign for the future. That's what worries me now the most. In the case for me, in the case of Islam, and I wrote about Islam in relation to the West for a long time, the case of Islam, I'm no longer concerned now, personally, about who did bad things to Muslims in the last 500 years. And I think that's history happened. In the course of history, stronger nations always dominate weaker ones. You know, stronger people always, you know, commit violence against weaker ones. I mean, it is a pattern in all of human civilization and history. So I cannot be way too moralistic about it, because this is what life has been. If you look at human history without sentimentalizing it or without moralizing it, it's a record of unremitting violence from day one. So we tried, I think our societies, our civilization has reached a place, Steve Pinker, for example, talk about this, that we are in fact we are becoming more peaceful and less violent. And if we keep that history in the past and begin to look at the present and the future, what do I see? Personally, what do I see? I see a variety of Muslim majority nations, from Morocco to Iraq to Syria, to Iraq, to even all the way up to Indonesia and beyond, who are, for the most part, especially the Arab-speaking ones, I would, you know, except for a couple of exceptions, Morocco actually might be an exception. I'm not saying because I'm native Moroccan. They are failed states. They're absolutely failed states. You know, there is nothing good in them. You can't even think of something that's, you know, they're deficient. And this is by the account of a group of Arab intellectuals who got together in the early part of this century and wrote several reports for the United Nations assessing the condition in the Arab world. There is no good education, no proper health, no research and development, no freedom of speech, no genuine women's rights, and no industry. And there is, on the other hand, a lot of religion. But what does that tell you? This is the condition. As I said, in the past, in the colonial period, one could have said, well, it's the fault of colonialism. It's the French people who came to these regions, or the British who came to impose a way of life, or inflicted this kind of damages on them. Yes, maybe. Maybe at that time it was possible and reasonable to explain one's condition in those terms, even though others had different opinions about what befell them. But today, nowadays, it's becoming harder to make. You cannot say Spain is the reason why northern Morocco is underdeveloped. You cannot say France is the reason why Algeria is in trouble. You could say that. Or you cannot say England is the reason why Egypt is a mess. Or you cannot say England is the reason why Iraq is a mess. So what I'm saying is, we are past that period, for better or worse. Maybe memories never die, I don't know. National memories never die, I don't know. But what we know for a fact is that this society, Muslim majority societies are in big trouble at every level of development that we can think of. And religion is not going to get them out of there. And so how then do we begin to approach the problem? The problem is now I'm going back to an idea that initially emerged out of Europe and the West and had a big influence on the making of the American Revolution, which is the Enlightenment. It is when in the 18th century, European thinkers in Scotland, France, and other places in England began to get away from religion and began to rely more and more on their reason or on the scientific discoveries to make sense of the world. And therefore, by merely doing this, it was a process that was facilitated rather briefly or by a very prominent Arab philosopher in Spain, in Andalus, Averroes, Ibn Rushd. But he was persecuted by Muslims. His books were burned by Muslims. Meanwhile, his work, which are very sophisticated interpretations of Aristotle's philosophy, eventually were very jarring to the Catholic Church, but he had his defenders in the European continent, and eventually the Aristotelian method, stayed and even flourished, and had a huge impact in the transformation of the pursuit of knowledge in Europe. Such thing, meanwhile, the Muslims burned his books because the Muslims had lost in a battle in Spain, and they thought the reason was because people got away from the faith. Every time a catastrophe befalls religious people, they think they had not religious enough, and that's why they're losing. And so they begin to condemn and chastise and persecute anybody who is not faithful in the way they want to see them. And so nowadays we find ourselves in this situation, and we have a conversation going on in the media, in the press, in politics, and the question, it's unavoidable, is what do we do with Islam? What do we do with Muslims? And of course, we all want to protect everybody's rights. The United States actually model is more beneficial than the European model, because in the United States, the revolution was not anti-clerical. In other words, it was not an attempt to discredit the church, but it simply separated religion as a private affair from government, which is a public one. And so everybody has a right to their own religion, provided that the government has no role whatsoever except by maybe granting tax exemptions to religious organizations. But how do then, aside from this, then how do we begin to make sense? How do we begin to have a conversation that is fruitful? We know that in Muslim majority nations, it's nearly impossible to find a constitution that doesn't proclaim Islam to be the official religion of the state. So if you lived in any of these countries, and if you're not Muslim, you have no chance of ever becoming, let's say, a leader of that country, or to be taken very, very, very seriously, because it is proclaimed in the Constitution. When the United States went into Iraq after they broke Saddam Hussein's regime, they came up with a constitution for the Iraqis and the Afghanis. And they could not get away from this provision. Islam still is the official religion of the state. How does one there, because the Muslims believe very firmly that sovereignty belongs to God and that we are here to serve the will of God. And in a democracy, people are agents of their own destinies. Sometimes they don't contradict each other, but sometimes they do. And so this requires a good, healthy conversation. This conversation is not happening. You find notions, I always get, I gave a talk recently in Rabat in Morocco, and we're talking about the same issues. And you know, you find Islamist organizations saying, oh, we need, you know, we need the democracy, we want to establish a republic, and so on. But both concepts, and we know this from Bernard Lewis's Political Vocabulary of Islam, have no existence in Islamic political thought. There's no such a notion as democracy, and if actually, or republic. So there is the caliphate, which you heard a lot about recently, or you can find the imamates, the imam as a ruler, or you could find some other forms of government, or this, I call the Moroccan form of government a sultanic democracy. But it's interesting because the concept doesn't exist. Democracy, you need to remember, emerged in a polytheistic society. Ancient Greece, which had many religions, and so people could get together and everybody was fine with everybody else's religion, but not in a monotheistic society. Monotheism implies the rule of one person, one God. When God eliminates all the other gods, and that God has the absolute power over everybody, everything and everybody, and we are all at the service of this God. This is a notion. This has a huge impact on the intellectual and psychological life of Muslims. And so Muslims find it very difficult to reconcile this notion of themselves with the notion of a set of the self that emerges out of a secular democracy, where one is an agent of one's own destiny, and then God may or may not exist, and that is irrelevant to the political process. When I once wrote a piece, it came out of one of my older books, and for the Chronicle of Higher Education, not long after 9/11, and I talked about a literature, African novels, mostly of Muslim protagonists, who are very talented and very promising, and they are kind of prodigies in their own societies and tribes, and they go to Europe, and they get totally confused, and they begin to experience psychological trauma. Some kill women, some women go into prostitution of some kind, and they usually come back home completely scarred, and sometimes they die too. So it is the transition from a traditional Muslim society, especially for young people going to college, into, and you could see that in the literature from the 1960s and 70s and 80s. If you read some African novels, you could see that. It's one of the major themes in them. And so when incidents like this happen, when you have situations in Europe emerge, so all you could do is go back to this literature, and it's there. It is a trauma for people to move from this kind of society to another one. And so that trauma results in all kinds of situations, not least of which, or at least including, the gravitating towards extremist views and committing acts of violence and terror. So, the point I'm trying to make is we need to be very aware of historical forces that shaped the modern world. So to understand the notion of a minority, I personally, in the modern world, I go back to Spain. Understand how Spanish identity, which was created, even though not successfully, on the backs of minorities like Jews and the Muslims, the Moors. And because the nation state, you cannot have an identity without excluding somebody else. You know, we only identify ourselves in relation to somebody else. So when I'm in Maine, I tell my students, and they kind of nod their heads, knowing, you know, sort of approvingly, said, we are Americans because we are not Canadian. They get it. And maybe if I were in New Mexico, I would say we're Americans because we are not Mexican. They get it too. So, and so on and so forth. You need the other. Unfortunately, I mean, we have psychologists here, professors of psychology who can help us with this. To form a national identity, somebody else needs to be excluded, because you can only define your national identity against another person's identity that is not part of your vision. And this applies at all levels, at the racial level, the national level, cultural level, even the personal level. You know, I am me because I'm not you, and you are you because I'm not me, because you're not me. And so this identity is sometimes an act of exclusion. It is by necessity an act of exclusion, although the positive side of people, more optimistic people than I am, would say, no, let's find out what we have in common instead of what we have that's different. So that's two ways to look at it, but it seems to me that once you manufacture an identity, you always automatically exclude something. And so religions are part of that process. Monotheistic religions, you know, they have, you know, I mean, all religions, but monotheistic religions, in my view, are the worst offenders. I'm including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You know, they have a view of the world that is, if you're not part of our religion, you're fallen, or you're not chosen, or you are going to go to hell, you know, and so on and so forth. And so it becomes a duty of the believer to either convert the other if you're in a religion that is given to this kind of activity, or to believe it yourself, to think that I am part of a chosen nation and the others are there basically like sheep or something. Well, they're second-class citizens. And that is one of the problems, I think. And I think, so what I'm saying is, given this cultural context we live in and this political climate we live in, we need to have a conversation. And in my experience, American universities or European universities or Moroccan universities are not doing it. You know, we are entrenched in our disciplines. We have an investment in kind of perpetuating the tenets of our discipline, or of our belief systems, the belief systems we had when we were in graduate school or undergraduate school, or when we are young faculty members. But I think the time has come to rethink, you know, a lot of our assumptions, because we live now in a different kind of world, and we need to begin to have a conversation. And what kind of future do we envision? Not for Muslims, not for Americans, not for Mexicans, but for humanity. You know, I mean, the idea of we are a combination of discrete groups, each one with its own peculiarities, maybe a good one, maybe can be consoling, but it's not useful to have, for all of us to have a common vision for the future. And I think that's what's lacking in our conversation. So in the case of I'm going to talk about Islam. In the case of Islam, it is my belief, and I wrote a book that is not included in these descriptions, or it wasn't included in my profile. It's called A Call for Heresy. Why dissent is vital for Islam in America. Why we need heretics. And I published the book in 2007 because I could see it coming. I mean, what we need to have is courageous people who are endowed with intellect and intelligence to begin to question, the dogma that have shaped their lives since birth. Whether it's in Muslim majority nations, or whether it's in the United States, or whether in Mexico and any other place on earth, whether you're Christian, Jewish, or Muslim. I think Christian in Europe and the United States are ahead of the Muslim majority nations. You cannot raise many of these issues in a lot of these countries. You cannot debate, you cannot question the orthodoxies of Muslim belief, of Islamic belief, because there's still laws in the books that punish people who do. Apostasy is a crime, and sometimes punishable by death in a lot of places. Now, not in all cases. There's some attempts at reform in some places, but if somebody one day gets up, you get up one day and say, I'm no longer a Muslim, I want to be Christian or non-Christian or atheist, you can either do that in hiding for the rest of your life, or you are in big trouble. Not just from the government, but socially. We read about blasphemy laws in Pakistan. You read about people being killed and persecuted in other places, only because they dare express their own feelings about their own beliefs. It's a huge problem. It's a huge human rights problem. It's no longer a question of diversity, of people having their own right to their culture, but culture becomes oppressive in itself. So when I recently wrote a piece for a collection on Orientalism, and I sided with Karl Marx, because Karl Marx is very often blamed, or at least he puzzled Edward Said when Marx supported British colonialism in India. Not because Marx was a big fan of British colonialism, but because he said, it's an inevitable course in history, because you're moving from Oriental despotism, which is, it's not that people had a lot of rights before British colonialism, but it is, but we are making, it's like capitalism. It is the last expression, the last manifestation, the last system in a series of systems that may eventually lead to a better society. So we need to be courageous enough to question our own belief systems, our own traditions. I talk in Muslim majority nations now, and because the other kind of activities are happening, it's easier to do in the United States and Europe, and to question everything that goes along with that. To give you an example, after the event of Charlie Hebdo, the satirical newspaper in France, in Paris, 30 Moroccans published a book. I was one of them. In response to that, condemning the event, and I was invited. There was, some of you may know Tahar Ben Jelloun and others, and I asked the question, can Muhammad be French? I mean, people didn't know how to make of the question, but I wrote a whole chapter on that, saying, what does it take? Can he be? It's a good question. It's a legitimate question to have. Can a Muslim with a fully believing Muslim, be comfortable living in a fully French society? There will be a lot of clashes experienced daily that can be traumatic to the individual, and so how do we manage the situation? And I think there's no other alternative to me, and I don't think, maybe you have other ideas, except separating religion from public life. Let people live their social lives, and if you have a faith of any kind, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, whatever you have, just practice it. If you have a relationship between you and your Creator and the God who created you, then you don't have to impose that on me, or on you, or on somebody else. When you begin to do that by law, with the power of law behind you, you moved away from a divine spiritual relations into a dictatorship, into an ideology. And when people say nowadays, I'm throwing out this remarks, maybe hopefully they will, so that you may have questions afterwards. Nowadays, when people talk about Islamophobia, well, I know that when I looked at it, the first time it was used, the expression was in relation to Spain, actually, in regard to the Moors. You can find it in one of my books. But nowadays, it's become something else. It's compared to anti-Semitism and so on. But Islamophobia is not a racial category. It's people are being accused of not liking Islam. Well, what's wrong with not liking Islam? It's like saying I'm being accused of not liking communism. What's wrong with not liking communism? What's wrong with not liking capitalism? What's not with not liking Nazism, or with Hinduism, or Judaism, or whatever it is? Because these are not people. These are ideas. These are ideas. These are ideologies. These are ideological systems. You're not disliking a person. You're disliking an idea. And there's absolutely nothing wrong in disliking an idea. And I think people shouldn't be embarrassed or ashamed of it, because you're only exercising your right, your intellectual abilities, your critical thinking to decide whether this is a good system for humanity or not. I just happen to think that a lot of these archaic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are no longer useful for the human race. But some people may disagree with me. Maybe some know there's some beauty in them and divine justice, and look at the cathedrals in Europe, and so on and so forth, and people otherwise would be barbaric if they didn't have religious faith. Okay, but I personally don't think they're useful. I think these are people, these are religions that were created at a certain time in history. They were attributed to 3 men who lived more or less in the same area. Apparently only these 3 men had access to God and nobody else did. And so now we are beholden, 2,000 years later, we are beholden to their belief systems. And we are supposed to live by them, and otherwise something bad will happen to us. It doesn't make any intellectual sense as we sit here at the UMBC to still think that those ideas are valid today. For the public good, they may be valid for your own personal good, like poetry is. You know, some people love to find songs. Some people like yoga. There's nothing wrong with yoga. But what I'm saying is, are they good for human civilization in this day and age? I personally don't think they are. And I think this discussion can be easily had in Europe and the United States, but nearly impossible to have in Muslim-majority nations. And I think we should try to have these discussions there as well, because I do, and not simply say, everybody has a right to their belief systems, even if you don't know what the belief system consists of, and which is very often the case, by the way, and just say, no, well, let's discuss this. What is this about? What does it entail? How does it affect the future of society? So when I tell you about all of this, it's not like I am trying to be provocative, and I look at a couple of people there in the back from Morocco. I really care about my native country of Morocco. I want that country to develop. I want us to have good educational systems, good research facilities, good, the freedom of expression and writing, within limits. I understand that. We need to have freedom of conscience. You have absolutely your right to your own conscience. We should eliminate any kind of punishment just because you happen to believe something that's contrary to the majority. And unleash the powers of innovation and creativity. The only countries that seem to have some power in the Middle East are the oil rentiers, the Saudi Arabias and the Gulf states, who pump up a lot of oil from the ground and sell it and make money that way. That is, these are parasitical societies. They have absolutely nothing to show for their wealth. They buy everything. They buy American know-how, Japanese know-how, European know-how, and servants from the Philippines and Pakistan and other places. And you cannot name one single thinker from Saudi Arabia today, or from Kuwait, or from the Gulf, or from Qatar. You can't think of one. I can wait for 5 minutes, maybe you can think of someone, and I'm sure you won't. They don't generate any intellectual value. Compare that to Israel, a tiny little state that has incredible intellectual power, scientific power. It's not an oil power in the world markets, but it has an incredible. What is the difference? It's the thinking, is the way the Israeli democracy functions. And when I was commenting on the Arab Spring, I knew they were going to fail. All those movements throughout the Arab world were going to fail because there was no vision. They were all protest movements. They all rose against corruption, against injustice, against all kinds of bad things. But there was no vision for the future, not the kind of vision that Theodor Herzl expressed in his Jewish State, published in the late 19th century, when there was no Jewish state. He wrote a little book and imagined a state in what's now in Palestine, and it would have these characteristics, these features, this society, a very liberal society, by the way, and I don't know, 70 to 80% of that vision actually came to be, happened. But instead, these protest movements in the Arab world, in Muslim-majority nations, were about going back to some purer version of Islam, going back to the 7th century when Islam was powerful, or trying to say that we had the golden age in Baghdad, when the libraries of Baghdad were munificent and attracted all kinds of scholars from around the globe, or maybe when Al-Andalus was a flourishing place. It's always a refuge in the past. The word in Arabic for alienation is taghrib, and the word in Arabic for the West is gharb. So it's alienation in the West, alienation in the past, alienation in history, but no confrontation, no dealing with the present and the future. And I think if our institutions of higher learning do not begin to approach this subject from this perspective, instead of folklorizing it or falling in love with it, with the Islamic literature and Islamic culture and history and so on and so forth, or romanticizing it, as often happens in departments of Middle Eastern studies and other places, it's not going to have any positive impact on those peoples in Muslim-majority nations. It will make our careers comfortable. We will become more knowledgeable about this or that, but it will not have a palpable impact, a liberating impact on the people of the Middle East, North Africa, or people who live in Muslim-majority nations. And I think I would ask that everyone, Muslim or non-Muslim, try to pursue this path, unless you believe that Muslim-majority nations are doing fine, which I don't see how anybody can make that claim. As I said, there are statistical reports, there are indices, and none of these countries are doing fine. I often, when people go to places, and usually like in Morocco, when I give a talk like this and people start complaining, I usually say, well, if you had the choice of studying in France or Saudi Arabia, where would you go? They all say France. Nobody wants to go to Saudi Arabia. Everybody wants to study in the United States. Everybody wants to study in the UK. Everybody wants to study in Germany. And yet, the trauma I mentioned, it's like, okay, we are in infidel, we are here by necessity because at one level, they recognize that these countries are advanced, there's more freedom, there's more opportunity, there's more kindness, there's more trust. And yet, there's a side of that psyche that keeps saying, well, they're not Muslim, so therefore they're not as perfect as we want them to be. In 2004, I gave a talk in Boston, and somebody said, you know, after 9/11, we were very concerned about a young man, and we offered him protection, and we took care of him to make sure he's not being badly treated by the population. And so that guy he said the man was so grateful. He was so joyous. He couldn't, you know, he was just absolutely overwhelmed with gratitude. And then he said to them, if only you could become Muslim. And so you could see the impulse. Again, instead of saying, great, thank you, it's enough, because that part of his brain, the part of the mind, always is, in the end, is if you are not Muslim, you haven't arrived yet. I'll stop here, and I'll see if people have questions we can discuss in relation to what I said. Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
I'm going to start. Thank you very much for raising these profound issues. I have two questions. Some people might call them thought-provoking, some others might call them provocative.
Yeah.
The first question is about the idea of majority Muslim nations being failures. And I'm thinking, why don't we look beyond the Arab nations, the majority Muslim Arab nations, to other nations that are not Arab, but Arab, that are Muslim majority? That's one question. So there is a lot to be talked about. Second question is about the issue of xenophobia, really, in most of Europe these days. It's not new, but we see it really. Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe. And I'm thinking, okay, is it because, is there something in European cultures, and I don't want to generalize, is there something that is kind of adverse to looking at other ways of being? That's my expression, be it in terms of race or religion or culture. That is kind of, that we need to look at. I've not seen anything written about that at all. Maybe you have.
Yeah. No.
That can kind of give us a clue as to why is it that we have so many manifestations of really rejection of the other.
Yeah. Well, this brings me back to that conversation about identity. I don't know. I mean, at the risk of being, politically incorrect, the last movie I saw, it's called Get Out. I don't know whether anybody saw it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting from a racial point of view. It's like in the United States, African Americans have no clue about the psychology of white people, basically. For those who saw the movie, how many people, raise your hands if you saw the movie. Anybody? Yeah, would you agree with this? The identity, the African Americans in the movie seem to be totally befuddled by the behavior of white people. Yeah, they don't get it. And the white people are depicted in this film as basically vampires. Literally. They're cold-blooded vampires who kind of prey on the energy of black men, of athletic black men. Right? Okay. I mean, I recommend it only from, again, those people who are interested in psychology and American race relations would find it very interesting. It's all done in the guise of, a suspense movie, a spooky movie, but it really highlights or touches on some of these very issues. Like we know négritude, c'est un sans idea that whites would never get blacks and would never have the power. So the question there is racial, and I'm very reluctant to believe that there is a racial element involved in discriminatory policies. I think it's mostly aesthetic. People may get used to people with similar skin colors, or different names, or food odors, or cuisines. But I don't think there is something genetic that has made the Europeans, let's say, because they're the ultimate villains among peoples of the third world, the Europeans are somehow exclusively, uniquely racist in relation to other nations. I think, personally, I think some of the most racist people in the world right now are the Arabs. And I'll tell you why. I mentioned in one of my books, you'll see that it's a part, you see how the Arabs, first of all, this notion of sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa doesn't make any sense, probably a legacy of colonial heritage. And Africa is defined by its skin color, which is the foundation of hundreds of academic departments in the United States, which doesn't make any sense, but there it is. In many Arab nations, you could be an immigrant for generations. You could be for 3 or 4 generations and never be entitled to citizenship. And if an immigrant in France, if they don't get their papers within a short period of time, they protest and they complain about Islamophobia and so on and so forth. So here's a country that looks bad in the news, and here's Saudi Arabia, which never grants citizenship to anybody, including Muslims and Arabs and so on and so forth, and nobody is saying a thing about them. So it's interesting. It's how the double standards operate in the way we think about oppression and exploitation and injustice. And I think it's the same happening in North Africa and other places. So you're right, Senegal, for example, and other African countries are models actually of coexistence and how Islam is practiced in the Sufi tradition. And it's not this strain of fundamentalism and extremism that many have inherited from Saudi Arabia and other similar places. But you could see it coming into Nigeria and other places and maybe infiltrating, Niger and Chad, and it's coming. It's like it's happening even in Malaysia and Indonesia. Recently you probably are reading about this stuff. Extremism, the kind of ISIS-like Islam, or ISIS, the brand of Islam, is rising in places like Malaysia and Indonesia. So it's something to worry about. And it's causing all kinds of trouble. So I think you're right to allude to the differences, but I think at the end of the day, we're all confronting the same problem in some ways. You may be in a better position, but I think eventually in the long run, if we don't do anything, I think even in the United States, we'll be confronting the same issue. That's what yes, Mariah, yes, you.
I just want to ask, when you brought the success of Israel,
yes,
the Jewish state,
yes,
what if we invest, the U.S. or the West invest the same amount of resources that it invests on Israel, for example, on Palestine, or on our part of the world, in Morocco, on education, on changing how people think. Because what happened is, in growing up in our countries, we always see the US as this great nation. But when we come here, we see, for example, you bring Saudi Arabia. And we buy oil from Saudi Arabia. But in revenge, what do we give them? We sell them arms. And we never invest on what really our population, our nations want. The people in Morocco want education. They will pay everything and anything to come to the US and study.
That's right.
We know we are among the one who are lucky because you paid for your education, or your parents had the money to come here. But for the majority. So if we invest the money or the resources on people instead of giving them on the government, which you know what they do with all these resources that eventually don't get to the population, and by then, education changes, how people think and how people see the world. So I think if we invest the same amount on our young people, then they would not go and join, the French, like ISIS and such.
Yes, I agree. We need education. But okay, let's go back to Israel. Israel established a Hebrew university decades before they established the state in 1948. They moved to Israel, to Palestine, and built a university. That's how passionate they were about education. It's still one of the top universities in the world today. And the early founders, by the way, when the Jews migrated from Europe to that land, many leaders of the Arab movement recognized the usefulness of the Jews coming back to their ancestral land. And they said, we are like lost cousins, and you're bringing with you a lot of knowledge that we need. Things change later on, but there's enough to show that relationships between the Jews or the Israelis and the Arabs could become incredibly successful if they knew how to think about each other. And so the problem, I had a very prominent speaker. I run a forum in Tangier called the Tangier Global Forum. Last year I had David Sibony, with Daniel Sibony, who is one of the greatest psychiatrists in France, an author of many books, 40-some books, among them books on Islam and Judaism and stuff like that. He was born in Marrakesh. He speaks Moroccan. He speaks Hebrew. He knows the Quran. He's a psychiatrist. I don't know whether you're a psychoanalyst, I should say. I don't know whether you've heard of him. He worked for years with Jacques Lacan, the great psychoanalyst, the French psychoanalyst. And he came to Tangier, a Moroccan guy, Moroccan Jew, came instead, and he said, okay, the image in the Quran of the Jews is very negative. How do we overcome that? And then people would say, well, no, I mean, we are very tolerant. Islam is all about tolerance. He said, well, I understand that, is Islam about tolerance? But if you look at the verse in the Quran, the Jews are represented very negatively. They're compared to pigs and stuff, and the image is simply not a flattering image in the Quran. And now, if you're a believing Muslim and you believe the Quran is the word of God, how do we overcome that? He basically stymied the audience. They kept thinking and scratching their heads and said, no, but we like the Jews, but we have a problem with Israel. But said, well, no, forget Israel. In the Quran, it doesn't talk about Israel, it talks about the Jews. So it is an interesting, the Muslims sometimes, what they do, or very often, not sometimes, very often, they try to evade the question by blaming Zionism and Israel, and they say we have nothing against the Jews. But Islam has a lot against the Jews. It's in all the literature, it's in the Quran, it's in the Hadith, it's everywhere. So we need to find a way, that's why we have to begin to think critically about our traditions. And I say, who said that? Where does Hadith come from? Where did that verse in the Quran come from? Etc., etc. We don't dare touch those issues because we think that if we do, we will become apostates. We will get out of the faith, and something very bad will happen to us personally and maybe even socially. So there is a lot of fear involved in this. And it's interesting, when I give talks like this, one of the frequent questions I get is that, aren't you afraid? Afraid of what? Because people know that if you speak your mind nowadays, some Muslims could do bad things to you. They can hurt you, they kill people, they bomb places. And so Islam has become synonymous with intellectual terrorism. In other words, if you cannot write what you want, you cannot say what you want for fear of somebody doing bad things to you, or to your mother back in the neighborhood, or to your brother or your sister or somebody else. So it is an interesting culture. It's a mafia-like culture, actually, in some ways, because you cannot speak your mind freely without worrying about being hurt or something bad happening to you. And that is something to consider. Now, in Morocco, I don't know what part of, I'm going there this Saturday. When I speak like this, people nod approvingly. They said, yes. I mean, there might be some disagreement, but you'd find less of that in the West. The feeling hardens here. For those who come to the West and migrate because they become increasingly more defensive about their cultural tradition, it's harder for them to do. Somebody raise their hand there, please.
Yes, but on the other hand, when you do criticize Israel, you often get accused of anti-Semitism. So there's something of a parallel there. I never understand that. You can criticize the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic. Now, some who criticize it are anti-Semitic, but there should be a way to make a distinction. Also, your notion of Islamophobia, you said something provocative, I think, when you said what's wrong with being sort of Islamophobic or in fairness, you also said phobic of Christianity or any of these religions. But what strikes me is that speaking about America, there's not enough people who know enough about Islam to really know whether they're being Islamophobic or Muslimophobic. And they are being Muslimophobic, I think, but we're using the term to connote the religion when we're really talking about the ethnic/religious distinction. So I think it's a little disingenuous to say what's wrong with being Islamophobic, because it's now being used in a way that is the exact analogy of anti-Semitic to me.
Yeah. Well, they're okay. I mean, probably it's a term that's been used, and I'm trying to remind people that if you do not like Islam, it doesn't mean that I don't like you. If you're a Muslim and I don't like Islam, I can still like you, but I don't like your ideology. I don't like the belief system. I don't like the Islamic literature, for example. I mean, it's my right not to like that religion according to my thinking. So, in people's view nowadays, that makes you somewhat Islamophobic, and it's not. It's like I don't believe in that, so I still like you. But I don't agree, for example, if you wore a certain kind of dress or garb, I don't know. But people have a right to have their own opinion without being called names, without being called Islamophobic or anti-Semitic if you criticize the state of Israel, or anti-American. Let's go back to anti-American. Now, you said people do not know enough about Islam. Well, I'm willing to bet that more Americans know about Islam than Muslims know about America. Because Americans, the people in the Muslim majority nations or in the Islamic world, they know America through television. They watch the TV shows, movies, and wars. That's all they know about the United States. They don't know American history. They know nothing about the foundations. They never read. I know a lot of engineers who graduated, PhDs, who graduated from American universities. They never took a class in American literature and culture. They never read American literature to speak of. They never read a book about serious book about American history, except when they have to take the citizenship test. So they live in the United States, but the entire knowledge and experience of the United States is what they see on television, in the news, and that's it. So I think Americans are far more knowledgeable, and the students in this university, there's no department of American studies to speak of in a lot of these countries. There are no departments of Jewish studies in most Arab universities. Morocco is beginning to get some Persian studies, Hebraic, that kind of thing, Chinese studies. I mean, they almost no knowledge, not to mention knowledge of history that precedes Islam. It doesn't exist. It's all the age of ignorance. It's all the fallen nations that preceded the coming of Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and the civilization that preceded them. So when you ask, the magazine that I published is called Tingis on purpose. It's the name of a mythical figure from the Greeks, from Greek culture, who was associated with Hercules, who was also associated with the giant Antaeus, which is part and parcel of Moroccan history. The city of Tangier, where it comes from, comes from a Roman name, associated with Roman mythology anyway. But people forget this stuff because Islam erases everything that comes before it and everything you have to pay attention to. That's why we are very badly deficient in all the history of ancient civilizations and so on. And without that knowledge, we would never be able to understand the future or how Islam came to be. And so one example would be that a lot of the words in the Quran are of Aramaic origin. I mean, there's no knowledge of Aramaic in most Muslim majority nations. And those who know Aramaic, I know one of them, is hiding in Germany because he reads the Quran differently. And of course, I know people who specialize in the Semitic languages, Aramaic, Hebrew, and to understand the origins of Arabic and where it came from. Such knowledge doesn't exist. And of course, not to mention the history of the making of the religion, which is what the magazine I do is dedicated to, is how Islam came to be. Instead of, you know, an angel appeared to a man in a cave, you know, that's one way to see Islam. But but intellectually it doesn't make any sense. You have to understand how a religion emerged in history, what influences, who wrote it, where the books came from, how it eventually was shaped into something nowadays we call Islam. But in the believer's mind, it was a man in a cave who was meditating, and there was an angel who descended on him and said and forced him to read. Now we know. This is another discussion we can talk about, but these are issues that are almost never raised in these nations because of the fear that everybody has of losing their faith or of questioning the wisdom of God. But if you are a critical thinker, if you are a scholar, if you are a historian, and you don't do this kind of work, then you might as well live in the mosque, because and then there were Muslim scholars, by the way, Muslim intellectuals in the 9th century in Iraq, very prominent, who questioned these notions, and they questioned the notion of prophecy, you know, and they were very famous. Some of them are like Abu Bakr al-Ghazali is a famous physician. He didn't buy the notion of God choosing a guy and speaking to him, and we're all supposed to believe that person, that man who's speaking to us. So it's a long story, but it's you could see the discomfort people would have around this issue. Yeah.
I understand how you made this connection between the desire to carve out an other as part of building an identity, and then sort of jump to religion as such an iconic, bad use of the word, but version of othering, right? But you know, in America, we have what to the outside world must look like in a way one white ethnicity that is so divided right now. It's unbelievable. You know, we have a huge cultural divide among people who must look to others as one ethnicity, if not a similar cultural background and so on. So isn't this human proclivity to create another more resilient than just religion? I mean, is it deeper than that? Is there a neural substrate to it? I mean, is this a bigger interdisciplinary?
Well, that is a question you raised, and that's a question I said needed a psychologist. I don't know. I mean, people need to differentiate themselves from others. I think maybe that is how human psychology operates. You know, the need for differentiation is very powerful, maybe. But you know, but also there is a need for absolute conformity. And this is some of the effects also of ideologies. You know, to be one and the same, to be indistinguishable from the other. And have the same beliefs, have the same names, eat the same foods, and so that you can feel you're part of a community. These are very interesting forces that work against each other. I don't know at that level, I don't know how much we can do. But I think to go back to the question you asked, I mean, I don't care, honestly. I don't care what, you know, Joe, Sue, Fatima, and Aisha, and Muhammad think about this and that. I only care at the end of the day about what I think about this. Because when I speak, when I talk, people say, well, people are not going to understand you. Or people are going to say, well, most people do not understand that. And usually I get this kind of comments from colleagues in the university and from other places, and I say, well, forget about the people. How about you? Do you get me? You know, I mean, people find refuge in the ignorant other. And they go, say, oh, well, Joe Smith is not going to get this, so I might as well not go there because it's going to be a waste of time. And that is not productive. I think we should go there. If you feel, first, even if you're alone in this, if you feel like it's something worth pursuing and doing, despite the noises surrounding you. Go ahead, go for it. Because something is driving you there, your intellect, your mind, your curiosity, and go and question it. The worst thing for a thinker to do is to buy wholesale what others told him, what your father told you, what your grandfather told you, what his great-grandfather told you. When I usually speak about religion, religion is a very interesting and curious intellectual tradition. Because, you know, I gave many years ago, I gave a talk in Washington to a group of lawyers, Muslim law students and lawyers. And so I said, in the course of speaking, I said, I don't believe. I said, I am not, my whole family, I come from a Muslim background, family stuff, but I don't believe in the theology. I'm culturally a Muslim, because I grew up in Morocco and Tangier, but I don't believe in the stories of the caves and stuff like that. And so I thought something was bad is going to happen, but at the end, there was a long line of people on the end asking questions, and one woman came to me and said, I totally understand what you said, but I cannot betray my parents. And I said, well, your parents are sending you to the American University in Washington, D.C., the American Law School, but they expect you to have the same ideas they have and their grandfather had, and your great-great-grandfather had, and the person who lived in the Middle Ages had. So in other words, what good is it for you to get an American education in law and have the exact same beliefs a peasant in the Middle Ages had?
Geometry.
Joshua, yes.
This will be the last question.
Okay.
You spoke of Israel about that the emphasis is on education, on intellectualism, on free thinking, etc. But Israel is a Jewish state.
Yes.
So really, are what you're saying about Islam, because you said states should not have an official religion.
They shouldn't.
Is it really that Islamic states should be more free thinking? They should be emphasizing religion. They should be emphasizing innovation. They should be emphasizing intellectualism, because it doesn't have to do with the fact that there's a state religion. It has to do with the whole mentality of looking at things to be the free thinker, the intellectuals, the educated, etc., and not to go on what you were just talking about, that old path, which was backward.
You know, when we talk about education, what do we talk about? I mean, I can open a school today. I can give me money and I'll open a school, and I can hire the teachers and have great classes and labs. But that school is as good as what you teach in it. What kind of curriculum you put in there. What kind of pedagogy you establish. I mean, you can have the most beautiful and most expensive schools. You can hire people from around the globe. But if you separate the genders, and if you ask people to teach a certain kind of religion and don't deviate from the certain kind of thing, then you're always in the same place. You're not going to go very far. So there is plenty of education. I mean, the Gulf states have great schools. They have education cities. They have education cities in Qatar, for example. And I mean, what do they produce, though? I mean, it's that kind of situation we're living in right now. We can't have an education. The question is not whether you have an education, but what kind of education are you giving to young people? And I think again, this is where we have a problem. I think it's you're right. States shouldn't have a religious identity. And in my last book, Islam and America, and I alluded to this in the last chapter when I spoke about this, so the danger of not establishing peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis is eventually you're going to end up with one state for both peoples, and which is increasingly becoming more and more the likely scenario. And then what happens next? And and it's going to be a difficult situation. But if you want to have, you know, but what I was talking about is Israel values the kind of creative education, the critical thinking education. And in fact, even in their armed forces, from what I read, even soldiers can question their superiors. Everybody's questioning everybody else in Israel. And so the result is a very creative, a powerhouse. I read a book, for example, called Startup Nation. I mean, every major company in Silicon Valley has a branch who has something, who has somebody connected in Israel, because that's where innovation is coming from. They don't have petroleum, they don't have a lot of resources, and they have their brains. And if the Arabs and the Muslims were to do the same, they will go farther away from what they're doing now. Unfortunately, we have a lot of religion, very little creativity and innovation.
All right.